Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Marco on RC Nerd 74. In today's video I'm gonna talk about the flex shaft repair I did on my Joysway Rocket 26 and the successful test drives with the repaired flex shaft. The issue was that the rear end of the flex shaft, which runs in the strut, came off the flex part of the flex shaft because of bad gluing made by the factory. And I tried to repair the flex shaft and I did some 4S test runs just to make sure that the flex shaft works well after my repair. So let's jump right into the steps of the whole building of the new flex shaft with dog drive and all the stuff you need. And let's have a closer look to all the details. Because I lost the whole rear end of my old flex shaft in the lake, I had to prepare also a new dog drive. So as you can see, I shaped the front end a bit round just to improve hydrodynamics. I had to put the rear end of the flex shaft into the drill and sanded and polished down the dog drive to this shape you can see here. And the idea is that you don't have a sharp edge where the water is getting blocked. Perhaps this improves the hydrodynamics a little bit. Then I figured out that the rear end of the flex shaft touches the stuffing tube in the front end of the strut. So there is a little bit of friction if you have the stock shape of the rear end of your flex shaft. So I decided to sand down and polish down the diameter of the rear end of the flex shaft a few tenths of a millimeter to make sure that it doesn't touch anymore on the stuffing tube, just also to reduce friction or to eliminate friction at this area of the flex shaft. Then I did the flex shaft check if it touches anymore or if there is enough play between the stuffing tube and the flex shaft, and I assembled the whole strut just to check if there is absolutely no more friction of the flex shaft on the stuffing tube, and that looked pretty fine. There are a few tenths of a millimeter of play between the stuffing tube and the flex shaft rear end part, so that seems to be a good solution to sand and polish down a few tenths of a millimeter. On the test runs I lost the rear end of the flex shaft. I also lost the rear end ball bearing in the strut because the ball bearings doesn't really have a great fit in the strut. So I had to install a new ball bearing, and to eliminate the play between the strut and the ball bearing I used a thin layer of tape and glued the whole ball bearing with some CA glue into the strut. And I hope like this I won't lose the ball bearing anymore and it stays perfectly in place and also perfectly centered to avoid the ball bearing to move around on the flex shaft rear end and in the strut. Then it was time to prepare the flex shaft rear end for gluing. So I had to clean and file the inside of the rear end of the flex shaft to give the glue the maximum possible grip and get out all the old glue out of the flex shaft hole. Then I also sanded the flex shaft itself with my Dremel just to make the surface more rough, to also give the epoxy more grip. And I cleaned the flex shaft also with thinner just to make sure that there is no more oil or grease or dirt on the flex shaft. Also to make sure to have the best possible grip of the epoxy connecting the two parts of the flex shaft. Then I wrapped both parts of the flex shaft with some frog tape to make sure to have no excess of epoxy on both parts of the flex shaft, to have a really clean flex shaft after gluing. so there won't be too much work to removing epoxy excess on the flex shaft. Then I mixed up my epoxy. I used 24-hour epoxy, so super slow epoxy, which is very thin, so that helps to get the epoxy inside the flex part of the flex shaft and the maximum strength of a connection you can get with epoxy glue. Then I soaked up the flex shaft with the epoxy and filled the rear end at least half the way up with 24-hour epoxy to make sure that there won't be any air inside the hole of the rear end of the flex shaft to get the perfect glue connection with the two parts of the flex shaft. Then I glued both parts together. I spinned and pushed the flex shaft into the rear end and squeezed the excess of epoxy out of the rear end to get maximum grip of the glue. Then I waited for 2 days to make absolutely sure that the epoxy is completely dry before I started to work on the flex shaft to go for the installation. So I removed the whole frog tape from the flex shaft parts and I cleaned the remains of the epoxy with a sharp hobby knife. Flex shaft was already pretty clean because of the tape, and I had just a little work to make the flex shaft perfectly clean. Then I used my ball bearing oil to oil the flex shaft to make it run smooth inside the stuffing tube, and installed the prop and all the stuff on the flex shaft and installed the whole flex shaft on the boat. Always make sure that you tighten up your coupler as good as possible to make sure that there is no slip of the flex shaft in the coupler and you have the risk to lose the whole flex shaft in the lake because of slipping of the flex shaft out of the coupler. For the latest test runs with the repaired flex shaft, I didn't want to risk my aluminum props, which are pretty expensive in comparison to a plastic prop. So I didn't use the aluminum prop you can see here, but I used some plastic props which had exact the same size to do the test runs. So there was no GPS runs just because it makes no sense with the plastic props, which are definitely a bit slower than the aluminum props. And these test runs were really successful, so I'm pretty happy with the repair result of the flex shaft. I really can recommend to use 24-hour epoxy, worked absolutely perfect. So enough talking now, let's jump right into the raw footage of the test runs. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked the video, have a good time, bye bye.